First, though, representing the River City and solving problems on a national scale, U.S. Representative Ander Crenshaw joining us this morning. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
I know we've worked a little bit to try and make this happen because this first month of the year has been very busy for you. Some of that was even busy the first days of the year, still working in Washington and trying to solve our debt issues or at least get a temporary solution there. Where do we stand on trying to move forward there with our national debt and the fiscal crisis that we've been facing?
Well, I think everybody knows that Washington has a spending problem, and so that's what we've been working on. And what we did just about a week ago, we passed a bill that's called No Budget, No Pay. A pretty interesting concept, because if you're going to stop spending money, one of the first things you ought to do is write a budget. That's what families do, that's what businesses do. But the United States Senate hadn't written a budget in 4 years. The House has. So this year we passed legislation that said we're going to raise the debt ceiling, but we're going to postpone that for 3 months while we give Congress an opportunity to actually write a budget to show how we can save money. So no budget, no pay. That should happen by the middle of April.
No pay for
the members of Congress. Members of Congress. We don't do our work, we don't get paid. But we're kind of focusing on the Senate because the House has written a budget every year, but we can't quite get the Senate to focus on that. I think this year they will, and then we'll decide, are these the right kind of cuts to make, because we've got to stop spending so much money.
Now, one of the phrases you just used there, let me ask about this. You said, we've got a spending problem. That's something that Republicans say. Do you think Democrats agree with that? I haven't heard them say that.
Well, I think most people, when they look at the fact that we're $16 trillion in debt, and that every year our annual deficit is over $1 trillion. I think Democrats and Republicans, certainly the American people, know that we got to stop spending so much money because it crowds out the private sector. Jobs are not being created. The economy's not growing. So I think most people say jobs, the economy, the debt, the deficit, that's a pretty big problem.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to talk more about funding and specifically how it relates to military in just a moment. Let me ask about this, because gun control this past week certainly was very high on the agenda. And you talked about the Senate. There were some hearings there at the Senate. And I know that you're not necessarily on a committee that is directly impacting this, but it's going to come to every member of the House and the Senate, isn't it? What are we supposed to do with curbing gun violence here in our country?
Well, I think it's clearly going to be on the front burner this year because of what just happened in Newtown and what's happened over the last couple of years. The problem is it's not an easy problem to solve. There's a component that deals with mental health. Probably part of it has to do with the violence in our country, whether it's the video games or the Hollywood movies. Parental involvement's part of that, and certainly keeping guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have guns, whether they have a mental problem or whether they're criminals. So I think we've got to focus on that, but it's complicated. But I think you're going to see a lot of proposals. And I guess I come from a point that there is a firm commitment to the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. People have a right to bear arms, and just restricting gun ownership is not the simple solution. It hasn't always worked in the past, but it's probably going to be a combination of things to look at and see if there's something we can do.
You personally know Gabby Giffords, is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so she testified this last week. Of course, she was the victim of gun violence in Tucson just a couple of years ago. She testified in kind of a brief statement, but you could tell it was something very important to her this past week. And then her husband spoke, Captain Kelly spoke about trying to close the gun show loophole and some other ideas. Let's listen to him.
But if we close the gun show loophole, if we require private sellers to complete a background check, and we get those 121,000 records and others into the systems, we will prevent gun crime. That is an absolute truth.
So while he's saying that's absolutely true, there's obviously room for other opinions. And one of those opinions coming from the leader of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, doing most of the talking for the NRA. And he testified that there's been a dramatic collapse in federal gun prosecutions in recent years. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's true?
Well, I think it is true. They look at Chicago, for instance. I think they're 80th out of the 88 communities they look at in terms of prosecuting people that shouldn't have guns.
Right.
But I think background checks, that's something we ought to look at. If there are ways that we can keep guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have guns, we ought to do that. The problem with restricting gun ownership, so often you just restrict the lawful owners' rights, and the criminals don't comply with those.
Well, let's listen to what Wayne LaPierre from the NRA said. He said that federal firearms prosecutions down 35%. Let's hear what he had to say this past week.
That means violent felons, violent gang members, and drug dealers with guns, and the mentally ill who possess firearms are not being prosecuted. And that is completely and totally unacceptable.
So, Congressman, the question I have is, do we have enough in place already at the federal level that we just need to enforce those laws and that would solve this problem? Because it sounds like that's what he's saying. It seems like there's a bigger issue here with people committing these crimes. Even since Newtown, we've seen a lot more shootings, and it's really on our radar now. If there's a shooting at a school, at a supermarket, at a theater, that it comes, you know, it comes out to us, and we're really focused on it. Do we just need to enforce those laws, or do we need more laws?
Well, I think certainly we ought to enforce the laws we have, and if you look at Connecticut, they had some of the most strict gun control laws in the United States, and that didn't prevent Newtown from happening. But I think it's legitimate that we take a look, but I think we got to be realistic and know there's no simple, easy answer to this. It's complicated, but it's appropriate to focus on that.
Yeah, Congressman, I appreciate it. Don't go anywhere. More to discuss with Congressman Crenshaw. We're going to hear his reaction to the president's call for immigration reform. We're also talking about funding for our military. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
Congressman Ander Crenshaw in his 7th term representing Jacksonville in Washington. So one of the concerns for Florida certainly is immigration. Is that just a South Florida thing, or, you know, how do you explain Northeast Florida's position on this when you talk to people in Washington?
Well, I think, you know, we obviously got a really large Hispanic population in South Florida, but all across Florida. It's amazing. All across the United States. There are an awful lot of people coming here, and most people come here legally. That's what made this country great. But the real problem is the illegal immigration, and that's something that we've been talking about, and sooner or later we got to solve the problem.
Yeah, the president spoke last week. He was in Las Vegas. In fact, I want to hear from him. He said basically he went to Las Vegas almost campaign style because he had said during his campaign, we got to focus on this immigration issue. And here's one of the things that he said, trying to make the point about we've got to deal with these 11 million individuals who are here illegally.
We have to deal with the 11 million individuals who are here illegally. We all agree that these men and women should have to earn their way to citizenship. But for comprehensive immigration reform to work, it must be clear from the outset that there is a pathway to citizenship.
So, Congressman, is there a need, do you see that that's valuable to have people who are here illegally see, well, I can make it legal, I can be here and follow the rules, and do you see that as something we need to change?
Well, I think that's the biggest part of the problem. The 11 million people that are here. But I don't think amnesty is the answer. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, right. Cuban American, has been a real leader in this, and he said the first thing we got to do is secure the borders to make sure people stop coming here illegally. Back in 1986, there were 3 million people here illegally, and they said, okay, they can all become citizens, and then we'll decide to enforce the border and stop people from coming here. Well, guess what happened? 25 years later, now we have 11 million people here illegally, and if all we do is say, okay, they can all become citizens, then 10 years down the road we'll have another 11 million. So we got to stop the illegal entry. That means secure the borders not only from a standpoint of illegal immigration, but how about the drug trafficking and the drugs and the human trafficking and the national security issue. And Marco's been very clear, we got to start there. If we can do that, then we can deal with employers who are hiring illegals. We can deal with how people can become citizens by getting at the end of the line, by paying a fine, by paying back taxes, doing certain things. But it all really revolves around securing the borders in the first place.
And you mentioned national security. Let's talk about that. You have been such a supporter of our military, and it's so big here in Jacksonville and Northeast Florida. So where do we stand with the potential cuts that are coming down the road and sequestration and how that would impact our military?
Well, let me tell you, this sequester is very, very serious because what that says is basically we're going to take $600 billion and cut it out of our defense budget over the next 10 years. But that's on top of almost $500 billion that the president decided we're going to cut from military. So the military's already shouldered, the troops have already shouldered more than their fair share of these cuts. But if you put in place this next $600 billion, not only will it destroy our ability to defend our country, even Leon Panetta, Secretary of the Defense, appointed by President Obama, they asked him, wouldn't this be like shooting yourself in the foot? He said, no, this would be like shooting yourself in the head. This would destroy our ability, not only from a national security standpoint, but think of what it does to our economy. In Florida, they say we'd lose 60,000 jobs. That's like Disney World just picking up and moving out of the state. So this is something that I've been working on to stop any way that I can. It's going to kick in on March the 1st of this year unless
Very
we change
soon, in other
something.
words.
Exactly.
So last question, we got about a minute left. How do you stop it from happening in just 4 weeks?
Well, it's interesting because last year the House of Representatives, where I sit, on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, we passed legislation that said we'll replace those sequester cuts to defense. We'll replace them with other cuts and not have sequester start. Well, the Senate didn't do that. Now this year, when we passed the legislation at the beginning of the year, the so-called fiscal cliff, we said, okay, we're going to put off the sequestration for another 2 months. But now the deadline's coming, and unless we change it, then we're going to suffer, I think, as a nation, and certainly here in the First Coast, because the Navy is such an important part not only of our national security, but our local economy as well.
Well, listen, I appreciate the time. We got to cover a lot of topics. Yeah. I think we could cover a few more, so I'm going to have you back if that's all right.
Love to come back.
Congressman, thank you very much. Ander Crenshaw with us this morning.